Imagine waking up tomorrow and every single clock, phone, and watch in the world has simply vanished. How would you know when to work, when to eat, or when to sleep? For more than 99% of human history, that wasn't a nightmare. It was just daily life. But our ancestors weren't lost in time. They were masters of observing the universe around them. The very first clock wasn't made of gears or springs. It was made of something you can never quite catch: a shadow. By simply watching a stick stuck in the dirt, early humans noticed the shadow moved in a predictable arc. This simple observation birthed the sundial, transforming the sun into humanity's ultimate timekeeper.
But what happens when the sun goes down? You can't read a shadow in the dark. Ancient astronomers turned their gaze upwards, mapping the night sky to track the passage of hours. The Egyptians' decans, or star groups, acted as a giant celestial clock ticking across the heavens. Certain stars rising over the horizon signaled exactly how much of the night had passed. Yet, relying on the sky had a massive flaw: cloudy days and stormy nights. Humanity needed a way to measure time that didn't depend on the weather. It was time to look closer to Earth. Inside dark caves and stone temples, ancient people noticed something incredibly consistent: falling water. This led to the invention of the clepsydra, a Greek word that literally translates to water thief. These weren't just simple bowls, they were carefully calibrated machines. As the water level dropped, it revealed markings on the inside, telling people exactly how much time had passed. The beauty of the water clock? It worked in the pitch black of night and during the worst storms. The Greeks even turned them into the world's first alarm clocks. Plato allegedly built one that blew air through a flute to wake his students. Nothing like a whistling water vase to get you out of bed at dawn. But water clocks had a fatal flaw of their own, especially if you lived in colder climates. When water freezes, time stops. So humanity turned to an element that thrives in the cold: fire. In ancient China, engineers realized that certain materials burn at an incredibly predictable rate. They created the incense clock. A slow-burning ember tracked the hours through a maze of ash. They even created sensory alarms. Different sections of the incense trail were mixed with different spices. You didn't have to look at the clock. You just had to smell the room to know it was noon. For a louder alarm, strings with heavy metal weights were tied across the incense path. When the fire burned the string, crash! The weight would fall into a metal pan, waking everyone up. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, they used a simpler fiery timekeeper: the candle clock. King Alfred the Great famously used candles of uniform thickness that burned down exactly 1 inch every 20 minutes. But fire is dangerous, and an unattended candle clock could easily burn your entire house to the ground. So fire was a bit too chaotic. Humanity needed something stable: sand. It doesn't freeze in the winter, and it certainly won't burn your house down. Enter the hourglass, or more accurately, the sand glass. Becoming highly popular in the 14th century, these sealed glass bulbs were a technological marvel of the Middle Ages. Because it was entirely self-contained, weather and temperature meant nothing to it. This made the hourglass the absolute perfect timekeeper for one specific group: sailors. Water clocks spilled on rocking ships, but the hourglass stayed steady, helping navigators measure the ship's speed and track their shifts. During his famous voyage around the world, explorer Ferdinand Magellan kept 18 hourglasses on every single ship. But sand runs out, and when it does, time stops entirely until someone is there to flip it over. Humanity needed a timekeeper that didn't need to be watched, flipped, or refilled constantly. The answer wouldn't be found in sand or shadows. it would be found in gears, math, and mechanics. In 11th century China, a brilliant polymath named Su Song designed a machine that changed history. Standing over 30 feet tall, it was an astronomical clock tower powered by a massive water wheel. It tracked the sun, the moon, the stars, and even featured wooden mannequins that struck bells to announce the time. This colossal tower paved the way for the mechanical revolution, proving that time could be captured by engineering. While China was building water-powered clock towers, medieval Europe had a different problem: keeping track of prayer times. Monks needed a clock that could run entirely on its own, without relying on water that might freeze in winter. The solution was a purely mechanical invention called the verge and foliot escapement. Instead of turning smoothly, this mechanism caught and released the gears one tooth at a time. This rhythmic catching and releasing created a sound we all know today: the tick-tock. Interestingly, these very first mechanical clocks didn't have faces or hands. They were designed only to ring a bell to call the town to prayer or work. The word clock actually comes from the Latin word for bell. But they had a massive flaw: friction. These early clocks could lose or gain up to a full hour every single day. Humanity needed a breakthrough in physics, and in 1583, a young Galileo Galilei found it while staring at a ceiling. He watched the chandelier swinging back and forth in the wind and used his own pulse to time it. Galileo realized something incredible. Whether the swing was wide or narrow, it took the exact same amount of time to complete. This principle of the pendulum was applied to clocks in 1656 by Dutch scientist Christian Huygens. Overnight, clocks went from losing an hour a day to losing just 1 minute a week. It was a revolution. For the first time in history, clocks were accurate enough that clockmakers could add a brand new feature: the minute hand. But pendulums had one major weakness: they had to stay perfectly still to work. If you wanted to take time with you, you couldn't use gravity. You needed something else to store the energy. Enter the mainspring. By the 15th century, locksmiths like Peter Henlein were shrinking clocks into portable brass drums. They were heavily decorated and worn as pendants, but they were notoriously terrible at actually telling time. It wasn't until the invention of the balance spring that watches gained the heartbeat they needed to rival the pendulum. While pocket watches were becoming a status symbol on land, a much deadlier problem was unfolding at sea. Sailors could measure latitude by looking at the sun, but figuring out longitude, east and west, was nearly impossible. To know your longitude, you needed to know the exact time back at your home port, but pendulum clocks were useless on rocking ships. In 1714, the British government offered a massive fortune to anyone who could solve the longitude problem. The world's greatest astronomers tried and failed. The man who finally won was a humble, self-taught carpenter named John Harrison. Harrison didn't look to the stars, he looked to the springs. After decades of work, he created the H4, a marine chronometer that looked like a giant pocket watch, packed with revolutionary mechanics. On a turbulent voyage to Jamaica, the H4 kept nearly perfect time, completely ignoring the rolling waves and temperature changes. Humanity had finally conquered time on the move. Ships could navigate the globe safely, guided by the gears in a box. But just as the oceans were mapped, a massive steel beast was being forged on land, one that would force the entire world to share a single clock. For thousands of years, time was completely local. If the sun was directly overhead, it was noon in your town. But a town just a few miles east might say it's 12:05. When travel was by horse, this didn't matter at all. But then, trains arrived. Suddenly, humans were hurtling across the landscape at 50 miles per hour. Railroad companies faced an absolute nightmare. In the US alone, there were over 300 different local times. If two conductors had watches set to different towns, two trains could end up on the exact same track. The results were disastrous. A Scottish-Canadian engineer named Sanford Fleming realized the world needed to completely redefine how time worked. He proposed dividing the entire globe into 24 distinct slices, or time zones, each exactly 1 hour apart. On November 18, 1883, North American railroads adopted this system. It was known as the Day of Two Noons. Towns across the country adjusted their local clocks to match the nearest standard railroad time. Soon, the whole world followed suit, agreeing to set the prime meridian, the master clock of the planet, in Greenwich, England. Time was no longer tied purely to the sun over your head. It was an abstract grid, unifying human civilization.
But mechanical clocks, no matter how perfectly engineered, eventually succumbed to friction and worn-out springs. In 1927, an engineer at Bell Labs named Warren Marrison sought to replace moving gears with invisible electricity. He discovered that if you run a small electric current through a piece of quartz crystal, it vibrates. And it doesn't just vibrate randomly. A tiny tuning fork-shaped piece of quartz vibrates exactly 32,768 times every single second. A tiny microchip counts those vibrations, and the moment it hits 32,768, it sends a single electric pulse to a tiny motor, moving the second hand exactly 1 tick forward. Thanks to quartz, even the cheapest plastic wall clock today is more accurate than the most expensive mechanical clocks of the past. Timekeeping was finally democratized. It was cheap, perfectly accurate, and everywhere. The problem of time was solved, right?
Well, not quite. For everyday life, quartz is perfect. But for modern science, it was nowhere near good enough. To run global GPS systems, launch satellites, and synchronize the internet, we needed to measure time down to the nanosecond. In the 1950s, scientists looked past mechanical gears and crystals. They looked into the very fabric of the universe. They discovered that atoms, the building blocks of everything, have their own internal heartbeat. When exposed to specific microwave frequencies, atoms absorb and release energy in incredibly consistent bursts. One element in particular was chosen as the ultimate timekeeper, cesium-133. While a quartz crystal vibrates 32,000 times a second, a cesium atom pulses over 9 billion times a second. In 1955, Louis Essen and Jack Perry built the very first practical atomic clock in the UK. It was roughly the size of a refrigerator, and the accuracy it achieved broke the boundaries of human comprehension. A modern atomic clock is so precise, it will not lose or gain a single second in over 100 million years. This invention was so profound that in 1967, we completely redefined what a second actually is. We have built machines that can measure the heartbeat of an atom. But what about our own biological heartbeat? Long before the first stick was placed in the mud to trace a shadow, ancient humans had a clock built directly into their DNA. It's called the circadian rhythm, a continuous 24-hour loop controlled by a tiny master clock in our brains. When the very first blue light of dawn hits our eyes, this internal clock triggers a surge of energy to wake us up. No loud alarm clock needed. The rising sun was more than enough to cue our ancestors' bodies to get to work. And when night fell, the fading light prompted our bodies to prepare for deep, restorative sleep. This biological timer is so powerful that if you lock a human in a pitch-black cave with absolutely no sense of outside time, their body will still naturally fall asleep and wake up on a near-perfect 24-hour cycle.
But humans weren't the only ones running on these internal, natural timers. Ancient humans looked to the floor of the valleys to read the living clocks blooming all around them. They observed that different species of flowers open and close their petals at incredibly precise times of day. A dandelion bursts open at exactly 5 in the morning,
while the yellow goat's beard closes its petals at precisely noon. Animals, too, served as highly dependable natural alarms. The morning chorus of birds was humanity's very first wake-up call. Even on a larger scale, the precise migration of birds or the emergence of cicadas told humans exactly what month of the year it was. By combining these biological and environmental cycles, our ancestors didn't just track time, they lived completely inside it. But tracking the hours of a single day was only half the battle. To survive, early humans needed to track the macro scale of time. If you planted crops too early or too late, your entire village could starve. You needed a reliable calendar. Naturally, humanity looked up at the night sky. The most obvious giant clock was the moon. The moon goes from full to new and back again every 29.5 days. This is the origin of the word month, literally a moonth. But lunar calendars have a huge problem. 12 lunar months equal about 354 days. That is 11 days shorter than the solar year. Within a few years, a purely lunar calendar drifts completely out of sync. You could end up trying to plant spring crops in the dead of winter. To fix this, humans built massive stone observatories to track the exact position of the sun on the horizon. The most famous? Stonehenge. During the summer solstice, the sun rises perfectly aligned with Stonehenge's central altar, resetting the agricultural year. Meanwhile, in Mesoamerica, the Maya developed one of the most accurate calendar systems the world had ever seen. But it was the Romans who gave us the foundation of the calendar that hangs on your wall today. Julius Caesar introduced the concept of the 365-day year and added a leap year every 4 years to catch the leftover hours. But Caesar's math was off by about 11 minutes a year. By the 1500s, the calendar was completely out of whack with the seasons. To fix this, Pope Gregory XIII had to do something drastic in 1582. He literally deleted 10 days from existence. People went to sleep on Thursday, October 4th, and woke up the next morning on Friday, October 15th. This proved that the macro clock was entirely man-made. Whoever controlled the calendar controlled society itself. While popes and kings controlled the calendar, the Industrial Revolution brought a new ruler, the factory boss. Before factories, human labor was task-oriented. A blacksmith worked until the horseshoe was finished, not until the clock struck 5. But machines didn't sleep, and they were too expensive to let sit idle. In 1888, Willard Bundy invented the mechanical time clock. Now, workers had to literally punch in and out. Suddenly, humanity wasn't being paid for what they produced. They were being paid for the minutes they existed on site. Benjamin Franklin famously coined the phrase, "time is money." In the factory age, this became literal. Efficiency experts stalked factory floors with stopwatches, timing exactly how long it took a worker to tighten a single bolt. The natural circadian rhythm was entirely ignored. Humans became cogs in a machine, driven by artificial time. Governments even invented daylight saving time during World War I, shifting the clock itself just to save coal for the war effort. Today, we are constantly chased by our own invention. We glance at our wrists and phones, forever anxious about falling behind. But despite our obsession with slicing time into perfect, rigid seconds, the universe had a massive plot twist waiting for us. In 1905, Albert Einstein proved that time is not a universal ticking clock. It's an illusion. Einstein showed that time is relative. The faster you move through space, the slower you move through time. And gravity affects it too. The closer you are to a massive object like the Earth, the slower your clock will tick. This means that technically, because your feet are closer to the Earth's core, your feet are actually younger than your head. But you don't need to be an astrophysicist traveling at the speed of light to experience time warping. We experience it every single day in our own heads. It's called psychological time. Have you ever noticed that an hour spent waiting in line feels like an absolute eternity, but an hour spent hanging out with your friends disappears in a flash? When you are bored, your brain focuses intensely on the passage of time, logging every single second as a heavy event. But when you're having fun, your brain releases dopamine, which literally overrides your internal clock. This is also why summers felt like they lasted forever when you were a kid, but years fly by as an adult. As children, the world is entirely new. Your brain writes dense, rich memories for every little thing you do. But as adults, our brains rely on routine. We stop recording the mundane commute to work, so the time just vanishes from our memory. Because ultimately, our perception of the past is just a collection of memories. No memories, no time. Today, technology exploits this psychological loophole on a massive scale. When you endlessly scroll through social media, the rapid flashes of dopamine completely hijack your brain's timekeeper. You mean to look at your phone for 5 minutes, but an hour simply deletes itself from your life. Ancient humans didn't have this problem. They were rooted in the present, synced directly with the sun and the seasons. Today, we have built the most precise atomic clocks in the universe, but somehow, we feel like we have less time than ever before. So, how do we escape this modern time trap? We can start by looking back at our ancestors. They didn't fight against time, they flowed with it. Try leaving your phone at home for just a few hours. Notice where the sun is in the sky. Allow yourself to be bored. Let the time stretch out in front of you without trying to fill every second with a screen. When you slow down, your brain starts paying attention again, creating those rich, dense memories. Suddenly, a single afternoon can feel like an entire beautiful week. Because time is not just a ticking machine made of metal or silicon. It is a biological rhythm. From a simple stick in the dirt catching a shadow on a hot afternoon, to water dripping quietly in dark stone caves, to the massive wooden gears of ancient clock towers reaching for the sky, and finally, to the vibrating heart of an atom. Humanity's journey to measure time is really the story of our desire to understand the universe. We invented clocks to help us build civilization, coordinate our efforts, and explore the stars. But we must remember that the clock is just a tool. It is not our master. You don't need an atomic laser to tell you when it's time to rest or time to eat. Your body already knows. The world already knows. The next time you feel overwhelmed by the relentless ticking of the clock, step outside. Look up at the sky. The sun is still there, and you still have time. If you enjoyed this journey through time, make sure to stay tuned for our next adventure. Please like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. Join us here on Fenwick.